Welcome to Bayhill Studio. I am so excited to share this project with you today. I'm calling this the Scrappy Patchwork clock, and this clock is easy to make. If you can make a half square triangle, you can make this project. And what a great gift this would be for anybody, from teenagers all the way to, your parents and grandparents. You can customize this with your fabric choices and with your placement of your blocks. You can make it super modern or super traditional, using reproduction fabrics or just bright modern fabrics or anything in between. You can see I really mixed it up with just scrappy mixture. There's a lot of Scandinavian prints in this, and so it made me think of my great grandmother as I was making it. But you can really customize this to however you want for your home decor, or keep in mind the person that you're making it for. All this is one big block, and you're attaching it to a wooden clock frame, and then you install your clock parts and you're done. That's it. When I say this is beginner friendly, I really mean it. You're sewing one little square, one little block to make this larger block. And there are variations in how you can arrange these half square triangles to make different patterns than what I have here. And I show a couple in this video. And I am so excited. Let's get started. To get started on our Scrappy quilt clock, we are going to gather a pile of scraps. These are just random scraps from my scrap pile. And because I want this very, very scrappy, I am not worrying about color selection. I'm just choosing all the colors. If you want a specific color theme, like if you want to stick with coastal blues and greens, then you can definitely stick within a color family. I am not doing that. I'm getting all the colors, and it's just, we're going to pull it all together into one big scrappy clock. Some of my scraps were already cut from a previous project, and they are exactly the right size, and so I'm just going to throw those in my cut pile. You can see that I am using this little Cute Cuts ruler. This ruler is by Lori Holt for Riley Blake Designs, and this one measures 2.5 inch square that will give us a 2-inch finished block. So I just put it on, let's see, here's a little piece that needs cutting. I just set it down, and I'm using, also from Riley Blake, this rotating Sue Daily rotating cutting mat. And I love it because it just saves my wrists. So I just put this down on the corner because it's already squared up on this corner. And I just cut right around it, and you've got the measurements exactly 2.5 inches. So that makes it really convenient instead of using a bigger ruler and trying to figure out. In fact, I'll grab one. Here's a larger ruler, and typically what we would do is we would say, okay, here's 2.5 inches and 2.5 inches, and we'd figure it out this way. This lays right on it, and you've got your square. You've got your measurements. So I really like that I have this as an available option, and I really like that I can turn this. So I'm not turning my body. Instead, I'm turning this cutting mat, which is so handy when you're cutting a big stack of squares. So I'm just going to get started cutting a bunch of scraps, getting ready to put these together, and then we'll sew these all together in our next step. My squares are now all cut and I am ready for the next step. I had cut 64, actually probably more than 64. I always cut a little bit extra, but you'll want 64 of these 2.5-inch squares, and I have paired them up. But I'm going to backtrack and show you what I do before I start pairing them up. We want to take half of them, so 32 of the squares, and preferably on the lighter fabric squares because you want to be able to see what you're doing on the back. I am going to, on the back side, draw a diagonal line from corner to corner, just like that. I go over it a couple times, and I use a mechanical pencil. I think it gives it a nice clean line, and there you have the line. So the reason I want to show you, the reason why I use a lighter, do this on the lighter fabrics, is something like this chambray doesn't have a light side, so it would be hard to see a line unless I use something like a really dark marker. But if I pair that with a lighter fabric that has the line, then I'm good, because only one of these fabrics needs the line, and this is our guiding line for stitching. So that's what you do, and then you'll just start pairing them up. And I like to pair small prints with larger prints and contrasting colors. And also I want it to look kind of random. I don't want it to feel like they have to be super matchy. But you can do this however you want. So here's just some examples of the pairings that I put together. And again, your scraps will look completely different than mine. So just pair them up so it has a nice scrappy, timeless feel. And after you have all of your lines drawn on half of your squares and you have them paired up, then we'll move on to our next step. Now we can start sewing these together and making our half square triangles. So to do that, this is really easy. This is a very beginner quilt block to be making. You're going to take your two squares and pair them right sides facing. And here you can see I have my little diagonal line facing up towards me so I can see it. And I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch to each side of that line. And that's all there is to it. And then you can cut through the line just like so. And then you would open this up and press this seam towards the dark side, like so. Press it, and then we'll take a ruler and square this up. And then you have two little squares that you've made. Now I'm going to tell you one trick that we like to do when we're quilting is to chain piece. When we're making something repetitive like this, take the same squares, line them up, and I'm going to sew this line, and instead of stopping, I'm going to stitch several stitches, and that creates a stitching chain on my machine, a thread chain, let's say, right here, and then in between this piece there will be a little chain of threads. And so I'll stitch, feed it through, and then keep stitching 5 or 6 stitches, and then feed the next one through, and just keep going like that. So I'm going to do that right now, and you'll see how that's done. All right, so now normally I would just keep going and do all of the squares, but I just, for illustration's sake, want to show you how that's done. And then what I want to do is I'm not going to snip these threads yet. I'm going to keep them attached, and now I'm going to stitch down the other side. So there you can see they are chain pieced, and then I can just take my scissors and snip those threads, and this just saves a lot of time. rather than doing each square one by one. And then you'll cut through the center and press to the darker side. If they're kind of equal like this, then it doesn't really matter, but typically the reason why you want to press to the darker side is so that you don't see that seam allowance on the top. It'll be hidden by the darker fabric. And that's all there is to it. We're going to keep chain piecing and getting all these squares put together, and then I will start pressing them, and then we can assemble our block. Now it's time to take our blocks and square them up. So when we sewed them together, let's see what they measure. They measure about 2¼ inches, a little less than 2¼ inches. And we want these to measure 2 inches. So now I am using a bigger ruler because I don't have a simple little 2-inch square ruler. I'm lining up the diagonal on our diagonal seam. And then I'm just leaving a little bit of fabric around all of the edges and trimming it off so that I have 2 inches. So you can see now that those two are trimmed, I can line those up on the 2-inch mark. And there we have a little 2-inch square. So I'll do that again. I'm going to line up my diagonal line on my ruler on the diagonal seam. And for this first cut, I'm just leaving a little bit of excess fabric around all of the sides, and I'm trimming 2 sides. So those sides are squared off, and now I can find the 2-inch mark and line it up exactly, and then trim off the remaining 2 sides for a nice clean cut square. And I'm just going to keep doing this with this whole stack of blocks until we have them all trimmed, squared off, and ready to go. Now is the fun part where we take all of our little squares and we are going to arrange them however we want. With half square triangles, your options are endless. You could play with different design options all day long. I'm going to show you a couple of options that I've been thinking about, and I still don't know what my final design will be. So we'll just play with a couple of options and see what we think. So the first I've started is just classic, where you line up rows and all of your diagonal lines are facing in the same direction. Now, one thing to watch for is when we made our half square triangles, we ended up with 2 of everything. And so the only thing we don't want is for those 2 designs to end up right next to each other. We want this to kind of be really scrappy, so we want it to look like there's a lot of variety in there. And so just make sure that you have them really mixed up as you're going along. And you can see this is cute. Like, I'm in love with this. Just classic, simple design. It comes together really nicely. And I like that. It's a really cute, scrappy look. Very traditional, something that I would definitely expect to see in my grandma's house. So there's one option. Another option is you could do something fun by creating like diamond shapes, where either your light or your dark colors are in the center. And some of these don't have a definitive lighter or dark, and so you just ignore it, and your eye will actually take care of it and shape that diamond. Even though there's not a definitive light or dark, your eye will create the diamond shape, so it's not lost in there, if that makes sense. It just fills in the gaps. So take a look at that. Isn't that fun? Let's just keep going with that just a little bit longer, because I'm really liking this. Oh, I love that. Okay, so we'll do one more. And again, here's one where you don't have an obvious light or dark, but I just want you to see how your eye just tells you the story, and it doesn't have to be exact light or dark. Okay, I'm really in love with this. This is a definite option for me. Well, they're both options, but this one might be winning. I love this design, so I'm going to keep this one in mind, and then let's do our final design. Okay, so for the final design, what we're going to do is we're just going to keep our center. I'm just going to pull these out because I really want to center this. Keep our center, and then our other fabrics are going to follow this same diagonal pattern coming out from each side. So just watch this. So from this side, I'm coming out in these the diagonal is following this same angle. All right, and then from this one, my diagonal lines are going to mimic these angles. And then to fill in this portion, I'm just going to continue. Now you see I've got this diagonal line going this way, so all of these are going to go in that same direction. And I'm not paying attention to light and dark here like I was in the other one. You can do that, and you can have rows of darker, a row of lighter, so you can really flip the fabrics around and even take it a step further, playing with that contrast. I'm not going to do that, but that's a really fun option. Okay, so you see how that's coming together. Now let's start on this side. So coming out here, I'm going to mimic this angle and this angle. And I'm just going to keep going with that. And then I'm going to fill in the gaps here. So now this is all going in this direction, all the angles, same direction. And then we do the same up. Okay, this just took my breath away when I saw it from, you know, sometimes you just have to like look away and then look back. This is gorgeous. This might be the one that I do. So I'm going to, now this is still my center diamond, and I'm going to take these two and mimic those angles. Okay, see, now this is the same, so I want it to be kind of farther away so that it's not right next to its pair. And then from both of these going out, we're just going to repeat. Let's see. Okay, so I have 2 extras. I knew I made a few extra. So if I wanted to go in and substitute anything that I don't absolutely love, I could do that for sure. Let's see. See if there's anything else that I want to subtract. I'm just not the biggest fan of this one for some reason, so I think I'm going to trade that out. I'm in love with this. This is the one. So the next step is I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew the first row and press the seams all in one direction. Then I'm going to sew the second row, and I'm going to press the seams all in the opposite direction. And then I'll show you when you do that, you alternate the way that you press the seams. Then you can nest the seams when you sew the rows together, and they'll butt up against each other really nicely and really decrease the bulk in your overall block. But isn't that stunning? I seriously want to make an entire quilt out of these little squares now. I am completely in love, and this might be the way that I use up my scraps. That is so gorgeous. And what could be fun is using the other designs that I showed you, the other 2 designs, plus coming up with more. And this could be one quilt block, and then another block could be one of the other variations, one of the other patterns that we came up with, and just alternate different patterns of half square triangles. That would be so fun. That might be my next project. So I'm going to take this now to the sewing machine, and let's start putting it together. So for this strip, you can see I pressed all my seams towards the left. So for my next row, I will press all my seams towards the right, and I will just keep alternating like that as I go. But here's one row, and we'll get started on the next. And you can see I tend to be, because this is so busy and scrappy, you might notice as I sew, I could chain piece rows, but my mind has a hard time keeping things straight, keeping the design straight in projects like this. And so I am taking it slow, one row at a time, one little pair of squares at a time, instead of quickly chain piecing, just to make sure I keep all of the angles as they should be and everything in the order that it needs to be. If you feel confident with just going ahead with chain piecing and your brain can keep it all sorted, do it. Mine just can't. I've got to really take my time and keep things organized in my mind and think about what I'm doing. And so this is how, when it's so busy like this is how I like to do it. At this point, I want to stop and show you my progress and a change that I made midway. I hadn't planned on this, but as I was working with this, I decided to make this change. So I sewed my first 2 rows together, and initially I was planning to add a border around the entire patchwork square, so that, here's my clock form, so that it would wrap around the edges like so, and then we will attach it to the back eventually. Because my 8 squares, my rows of 8 squares are not going to reach the edges, and so I thought a border would work perfect. As I was working on this, I thought, you know what, I want to keep this scrappy look going, and so instead I'm just going to add squares to each side that are not half square triangles. I don't think it will even be noticeable. And I just wanted to keep that going. So I cut 2" by 2.5" rectangles. These are 2 inches, 2" squares, and so my 2 inches is to fit the squares. So I'm sewing, let me grab 2 of these to show you. I'm sewing the short side of the square, the short side of the rectangle to my squares. And I'm going to do that to the end of every row on each side. And those will just wrap around like that. And at the bottom, they honestly won't even show. So you don't necessarily have to do it at the bottom, but it'll be easier for continuity too, and putting this whole thing together to do the same thing all around. Now you could do what I had originally planned and just add a border if you want, but when I put the instructions on my blog, I will add the instructions for cutting these little rectangles and sewing those on, because I just like that better. I like how that looks, that patchwork look. So I have done my first 2 rows. I pressed my seam open, and now I'm just going to keep going with all the rows, adding my little rectangles, which I cut here, and I'll just put them where they're easy to reach, to each side. And let's just keep going and get this done. Okay, so this third row is done, and now you can see how it will come together. I will press it and add it, and then just keep going, and I'll show you the completed block in just a moment. I have everything finished except for the last row, and I want to talk to you about this because as I added my additional rectangles to the side, I also went ahead and added a row to the bottom, and instead of adding it to the individual blocks, because this row was already finished, I just sewed the long ends like so together and created this row and added that. And you'll see because these are 2.5 inches long and 2 inches wide, that this didn't come out the full 2.5 inches. That's not going to show. In fact, these 3 squares probably won't show as we tuck it under, but I sew them there just to be safe. But don't worry about that at all. Just keep it that way unless you really want to create that extra 2.5 inch square block to sew on the corners. They won't show though. So for this final row, I am going to, ahead of time, sew one of these short ends to the top, and then after I do that, I will sew another rectangle to the side, and we'll just keep that going, and you'll just watch as I do this final row, and then we'll start putting the whole thing together. Okay, so I just need to add these 2 last little pieces that may or may not show. Here we go. So we've just got one that needs to go here and one that needs to go here. So I'm actually just going to sew them together kind of wonky like this. And I will just finger press that seam open and sew it right on there. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know if the way I just did it by adding these last rectangles individually is any better than here, where I added this row at the end. I kind of think this way was faster, and that's probably how I would do it next time. But either way works. So we'll just go here and here. Okay, I'm going to press this and then we will add it to this final row and start putting together our clock. For this next step, you could add batting and quilt it as you would any quilt. I didn't want to create all of that bulk, and so I thought long and hard, and for me I decided against it, but I still wanted to add a bit of structure to my block so that as I tighten it around the wooden form, clock form, that it's not pulling and stretching out of shape. So I decided to use fusible interfacing. This is Pellon SF101, and I have here the glue bumpy side facing up, so it's facing the wrong side of my block, and I'm just going to press it to the wrong side, and that will give it that stability so it doesn't get completely stretched out of shape as I attach it to the wooden clock frame. So there it is. She's all pressed and ready to go. So now we just need to grab our wooden clock form. And what I want to do is position the center right over it like that. I decided to move the iron out of the way. It'll make it easier. Again, we want to line up that center point of the diamond right there over the center. And I'm going to actually get a pin. Just make sure, yes, I am exactly where I want to be. Okay, so I'm going to take some glue, and some spray adhesive would work great here, but I'm just going to glue some dots just to hold this into place while I work. And then I'm going to, and this is why you need the glue, I'm going to turn it over. And this is super easy. You might be able to get away with a hot glue gun, but I'm going to use a staple gun. And I'm just going to, let me move this glue out of the way. And I'm just going to staple this to the form. And I'm going to start on one side and then on the other, and not pulling, just gentle pull, not trying to be too aggressive with my tension on this. I don't want it loose, but I don't want to stretch it either. And then I'm going to start at the top. And at the bottom. And then we just work the same way we worked from these 4 quadrants. Now we're going to go to these 4 quadrants. And then from here, you're just going to staple it all the way around. You can fold these over if that works, and just get it all stapled on. Be very generous with your stapling. And I have 2 staples here, and so I just go right into the middle, and just like we've been doing, work from the middle outward. Oh, I just ran out of staples, so I'm going to go refill and then we'll finish. Now I'm feeling some staples that are protruding more than I want, so I'm going to take my hammer and just flatten some of these out. Okay, so I've got it exactly how I want it. You can see I was really generous with my stapling. I have 2 to 3 rows of staples in some places where I just felt it needed it, and every single portion is stapled. And now I'm just going to go around and trim about 1/4 inch from the staples. Trim off all the excess. Okay, I am so excited to turn this over and see what it looks like. Now, if you don't like these raw edges, you can always hot glue maybe a ribbon or something just to cover those up. I'm not going to worry about them. Look at that. Look at that. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Okay, and to go with this, I bought this basic clock kit. So I'm going to follow the instructions on the back for installing it. I'll definitely need to poke a little hole in the center and I'm going to ignore the numbers. I'm not even going to bother. If you want to have numbers on there, go for it. This is more an art piece for me, and so I'm going to ignore the numbers and install just the hands and the little motor. Well, thank you for joining me on this fun, scrappy patchwork clock making journey. I didn't have a definitive plan when I started, and this was just a very organic project, and I am in love with the result and can't wait to make more of these. I'd love to see this backdrop with a sawtooth star or another fun type of quilt block. My suggestion is to keep the components of the block very small. These are 2-inch squares. That just allows you to get more color and vibrant design into the overall design of the clock. Other than that, it's a free-for-all. Any quilt block that you want to do would be amazing as a background for this. Now, if you don't want to add the squares and you want this all to be half square triangles instead of the little border pieces that I added, you can go ahead and make them all half square triangles. Instead of the 64 half square triangles, you would need 100 half square triangles to make 10 rows by 10 rows. As you can see, you can hardly see those little bits that we had to add. I don't even think you can tell the difference. You could add just a solid or print border. I think that would stand out and it would look fine, but it would stand out. So it depends on what look you're going for. I opted to continue with the scrappy look, and I'm super happy with this. I seriously am going to be giving this as gifts to everybody. I am in love with this project. It was so easy and such a fun way to add decor and to share the love of quilting with everybody. I hope that you all go ahead and make some of your own and tag me on Instagram at Bayhill Studio. I'd love to see what you make. And if you like this content, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And I will be making more content, fun content like this, and have so much fun on this journey as we create together. Have a great day.